Hi, I am going to be talking a little bit today about attachment and attachment theory. My interest in this comes from some time spent with in the foster care system and assisting some students and kids that were dealing with some difficulties through our youth group, and some of the things that we learned from the counselors about their difficulties in attaching and trusting adults within their proximity. And so to begin with, to give a baseline of what attachment itself is the emotional bond that is formed between an infant and the caregiver. It is developed when there is a demonstration of consistent security in the presence of that caregiver. And this starts from birth and is essentially established as a foundation within the first 18 months of life. Some of the characteristics that you might find that demonstrate a component of attachment is that the child would have a safe haven, meaning a secure person to come to when they feel threatened or scared. They would also have a secure base, and so if the child had a question about their father being sick or something to that effect, they could go to their mother and seek out some understanding of that, and they have a safe place to work out the world, a secure base to work out the world. Another characteristic of attachment would be considered proximity maintenance, and that's when the child feels comfortable to explore the world, but within a nearness to that caregiver that they trust, that they find security in. And the last characteristic that demonstrates that there's some sort of attachment going on is separation distress, when that child does not want to be separated from that caregiver that they depend on. Now, one of the primary theories that has to do with attachment is Bowlby's theory, and his thought was that infants who enter the world are predisposed to attach to a caregiver for nurture and security and safety, etc., and that this was almost an evolutionary concept, that this was needed for newborns to survive in the world. The attachment theory also points out that adults can enhance attachment by showing appropriate and consistent response to the needs that the child has, and that the attachment that is formed at that really early age, that primary attachment, is an internal working model that can affect the future attachments that that young child grows up to have, whether that is in friendships, in their relationships at work, or even in romantic partnerships. So there's this continuity to that theory. Now, there are a few key figures that I'm highlighting today that learned things, studied things, and contributed to the attachment theory. The first one, like I said before, is John Bowlby, and he used to be a psychiatrist at the Child Guidance Clinic in London, and he associated children's early attachment to a mother as a component to social, cognitive, and mental development. He also theorized that infants have this universal need to seek out a caregiver, especially when feeling threatened. Once again, that sense of this evolutionary-based need for attachment. Mary Ainsworth also contributed to attachment theory. She actually performed what was called the Strange Situation Procedure experiment in, I believe, 1978, and she established from that experiment that there were a few different attachment styles. So if you follow her up here, the Strange Situation Procedure was sort of a basic experiment done where an infant was placed in an unfamiliar environment with his or her mother, and then they would allow a stranger to enter the room and gradually become closer to that child. At some point, the mother would leave the room, and then after a given time period, she would return again, and they would observe each of these steps, including that response of the infant when the mother returned again. The last key people I'm going over are Rudolph Schaefer and Peggy Emerson, and they performed a stages of development experiment, and they concluded that babies showed sensitive responsiveness, meaning that however well the caregiver responded to their needs, meaning understood their needs and met those needs in a timely manner, that was how attached the infant would become to the caregiver. They also noted from their experiment that it didn't seem to be the caregiver that spent the most time with the infants that they became most attached to. Rather, it was the caregiver that best responded to their needs. And so from their experiment, after studying 60 babies for the first 18 months of life and having the mother's log information and having frequent home visits and also speaking with caregivers within the proximity regularly, Schaefer and Emerson both concluded that there were a handful of stages of attachment. They said there's asocial attachment between 0 to 6 weeks, where infants just respond genuinely positively to anybody that comes around them and makes them smile. After that, from about 6 weeks to 7 months, there's an indiscriminate attachment where they just like having somebody around there interacting with them. And when that person steps away, whoever it may be, they might grow fussy or upset. 7 to 9 months, they saw specific attachment. That's when the babies kind of have that separation anxiety and that fear of strangers, and they really are attached specifically to one caregiver that they really, really feel dependent on. And then over time, 10 months onward, they begin to develop multiple attachments, maybe to neighbors or grandparents or other adults in their life. Now, Mary Ainsworth, when she performed the strange situations procedure, she noted that there were about 3 different kinds of attachment. And later, another person theorized that there was actually a 4th style of attachment. And these styles of attachment, studies have found that often whatever kind of attachment we form early in life, that continues on long past our early years. As we said before, there was a continuity to this theory. And so whatever kind of attachment I formed as an infant very well could be the kind of attachments that I form and how I relate to my husband today. Now, about 30% of people, based on recent studies, actually will have adjusted their attachment style over time. And they also have found through recent studies that if you intentionally try to adjust your attachment style, you are able to do so, but it might take some effort. So the attachment style that would be considered the healthiest is the secure attachment style. And the secure attachment style demonstrates that the infant or the human has self-confidence, honesty, and that they are responsive, that they feel that they are deserving of love, that they have a flexible response to separation. And this is associated with infants that had more positive interactions with their caregiver. Adults that have a secure attachment tend to have more confidence in their relationships. Studies have found that the cognitive, social, health, and psychological development of people with secure attachment are all higher than those without a secure attachment, which I thought was really interesting. The second form of attachment is anxious or ambivalent attachment. And this might be characterized by insecurity, fear, and oversensitivity, and this general fear that affection is not going to be reciprocated. And this is associated with inconsistent and undependable caregivers that maybe have poor timing response to their infants. They found in studies with infants that had anxious attachment that they were disinterested in interacting with the caregiver. Adults that have an anxious attachment might feel doubtful of healthy relationships. And we have found that children with anxious attachment have greater aggression and greater behavior problems and social anxiety. They also found that there is a hyperfocus in psychology with negative emotions in those that have an anxious attachment style. The third original attachment style was avoidant or dismissive. An avoidant and dismissive attachment style might present itself as this general self-sufficiency, this dismissive feeling, and this distant way of connecting with people. Infants with this sort of attachment style demonstrated an avoidance with connecting with the caregiver, a discomfort with physical contact, and little to no distress at the separation point. Avoidant attachment was linked with future chronic health conditions. It was linked to social anxiety, and they've even found a link with this desire to isolate from others during painful situations, whereas, say, in a secure attachment, somebody tends to reach out and seek out support when they are going through crisis. Later in the game, disorganized attachment was added by Main and Solomon in 1986, and this was associated really by associated with caregivers that maybe demonstrated like their own scared responses or maybe intimidating behaviors toward the child. And people with this disorganized or fearful attachment are the people that are going to most struggle with adjusting their attachment style later in life. They tend to be self-defeating, they tend to be inconsistent, they tend to be isolated a lot of their lives. And this is interpreted, the things that Maine and Solomon observed, they interpreted the response as this confusion within the infant, where they were forced to rely on this figure that was inconsistent in their lives for their security. They were forced to rely on somebody that caused them to feel insecure for their security, and so that caused that disorganization and that confused feeling. The main criticism of attachment theory is that they don't feel like there's been enough studies to demonstrate that there is a continuity to it, and that it didn't fully encompass, like the main primary experiments done didn't have a hyper focus on taking into account social class, gender, ethnicity, or the culture of the people that were involved in those studies. And those are important factors. However, a lot of counselors today kind of rely on it, or at least investigate people's attachment styles. And so there are quite a number of people that still put a lot of weight into Bowlby's attachment theory.